All right. Well, I have a topic for today, but we could certainly start with questions. Do either of you have a question to get us rolling?
I wanted you to, we talked about this a little bit before. You asked for a subject, and I suggested the one that I would like to know the most about was voice, finding your voice. And I don't know the process you did or the magic that hit you or lightning or whatever, but that's what I'd like to know.
That is a tall order, Alan. Good grief.
That's because you're talented. I have faith in you.
Well, thank you. Let's start with a definition. I'm going to let you two tell me what you think voice is first. Okay, so either of you can start us off. What is voice?
Well, I've always had trouble. Are we always talking about the narrator's voice then? Are we talking about, well, if it's not first person narration, then I think of it as narrator, the tone, like whether in describing a character there's a kind of judgmentalism, that would be a more judgmental voice.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly, I usually can't feel I don't feel I've identified a very distinctive voice unless it's caustic or it stands out in some way. It's
right.
more natural, I think.
Okay. What do you think it is, Alan?
I think there's two. Number one is the author's voice, the word choice.
Mm-hmm.
The second is kind of the voice of the character, not just in dialogue, but kind of how they perceive things. If you're writing it, whether first or third person, it seems to me. The details they notice and their impression of places and setting and that sort of thing. That's kind of how I picture it, but I don't know if that's right.
Okay. Let's see. I think, Alan, if you could mute your mic when you are not talking, I think we're getting feedback off of your computer. Thank you. Are you hearing feedback, Madeline?
Not now, but maybe it's my mic, right? I don't hear any feedback now.
No, I'm not. I'm hearing a little feedback of my own voice.
Oh, wait.
So I can keep mine muted. That's fine. I don't mind.
Okay. And maybe you should both mute mics and then just unmute them anytime you want to talk.
Okay. So okay. I have to figure out how to do that.
In the bottom left hand of the Zoom panel, there should be a microphone with the word mute under it.
Whoops. Uh-oh.
Well, don't worry about it. So, all right. So voice is one of those difficult things to grasp because it is so intangible. You're both on the right track. You're both listing qualities of voice. And because I wasn't prepared for this question, I don't have like a prepared answer for you. But I think of voice as the voice of the piece, the tone of the piece, the style in which the piece is delivered. So it's the whole of the piece that we're concerned with. Now, it is the narrator and the narrative that we're primarily concerned with when we talk about voice. It is often natural. I think you used that word, Madeline. It's because as readers, it seems natural because we tune into it the way we turn into the way somebody speaks to us. And that feels natural. So you might have an authorial narrative when the voice is the voice of the author. And that can become an invisible voice. That's why it feels so natural to us. It's just the tone of the story. You can also have an essayist narrator. That's a literary theory term. It doesn't mean we're writing essays, but it means that the narrator has a personality that jumps off the page at you, and the narrator is going to express opinions the way an essayist does, right? So that's when that becomes something we tune into very quickly, such as if it's sarcastic or a humorous narrator, right? We've got that personality coming off the page at us. Alan, you were talking about the character's voice. So when we talk about a character's voice, we're really talking about point of view and that character's perspective. Now, I'm going to get a little complicated or possibly, hopefully not confusing here. But when we talk about point of view, we are not just talking about the character's perspective. We're talking about the whole of the work. So everything I've just said about voice applies to your point of view. Okay. So when we say a book is told in a close third, past tense, we've got an external narrator, not the characters, right? An authorial narrator or a essayist narrator, someone who is external to the frame of the story, telling us the story. And they might be very natural. They might be very personality driven, that essayist. Okay, they will have a voice that is the umbrella shape of the entire piece, right? But then when we go into the character's point of view, we mean that character's perspective, that character's lens on the world of the story. And that's when we get into the individual personality of the character or characters whose heads we enter. Okay, does that make sense so far? You can nod if you don't have a question. Yeah, okay. And just unmute at any time if you want to ask me a question. So when I think of voice, I'm really thinking about the voice of the piece, that narrative voice, not the voice of the character, because the voice of the character is really a spoken thing. It's something we get in dialogue and thoughts, right? So the narrative voice can enter a character's perspective to explain that perspective to the reader without changing voice. It's like if I tell you that my mother grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and had 9 siblings, and, you know, times were hard, and her parents were depression babies, and as a result of this, my mother has a certain perspective on the world. That's narrative. And you might know my mother better, but I'm not in her head thinking her thoughts. All right, does this make sense so far? Let's unmute and see where we're at.
That makes sense. I think I was mixing up the two.
Mm-hmm.
And you're separating them really helps clarify. So a narrative voice, I'm thinking of like Catcher in the Rye, where that sassy kid just starts off and he just never lets go.
Right.
But because everything is through his perspective, that really sets the tone for the whole work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in that case, they're more closely intertwined than if it's third person, right?
Right. So now You're leading us into a discussion about first-person narrators versus third-person narrators.
I don't mean to.
No, it's good, because we should clarify this. Right, definitely. So before we talk about first versus third person, do you have any questions or comments, Madeline? No, okay. All right. So When your narrator is first person instead of second or third, second, we aren't going to touch that, but I just want to acknowledge that is another possibility as a second person narrative. When you have a first person narrator, then your narrator and your character are one and the same. So then your narrative voice would be the same as that POV character's voice. It's just like if you're writing a memoir, you're telling your own story in your own words. And you might adopt an ethos to tell this story that is like putting on that hat of narrator. So you might sound intelligent and reasonable and objective when you're telling your story, but it's still you using your words and your background and your life experiences to tell that story. But then if you drop into a scene and show what it was like when you discovered your best friend stole your boyfriend, you might be showing yourself as irate and screaming and whatever else comes out in that moment. So even in a first-person narrative, you're going to have a certain degree of layering, right? There is the character who is telling the story to an audience, whether that audience is the assumed reader or somebody specific, like your grandchildren, you know, the character's grandchildren, or the protagonist doctor, or whoever that audience is. Okay, so you've still got the storyteller and the actor or doer within that story. So we still have layering, but the voice should be the same. As readers, we should be able to recognize that the person telling the story is that character. So whatever background, whatever education level, whatever region of the country or other country, if it's outside of America, whatever qualities and traits you give this character, they apply to the narrator as well. Okay? Now we're going to go a step deeper into this, into the mire here. Because your narrator and your doer are the same person but different, you have to be aware of time and place. So is your first person narrator 80 years old, sitting on the porch with the hound dog and a cup of tea or brandy or whatever? Or, you know, telling a story from when he was 20 with lots of time and distance to gain perspective, to be reflective, to lessen the emotional weight of those events? Or is your narrator character 2 months or 2 years outside the frame of the story, right? So how much objectivity and how much emotional charge you put into that narrative is going to depend on where you place that narrator in relation to the actor in the story. So same person, but different. Does that make sense?
Is this like Alice Walker's The Color Purple?
Gosh, I'd have to look at it to see what she's doing with her narrative.
Her narrator is well, she's telling the story as an older woman. Mm-hmm. But she's talking about herself as a little girl, and she's not directly, the audience is understood to just be out there. It isn't like she's sitting on the porch rocking, telling the granddaughter or something. Mm-hmm. And so is that what you mean by keeping in mind time and place?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That an old woman telling about something that happened 50 years ago is going to do it differently than a young woman telling about something that happened earlier that day.
Right. Or even a year ago. So think about like the worst relationship ending in your life, whether it was a bad breakup or a death or somebody moving away. It takes time to get over that. It takes time for you to see things in perspective and to move out of a place of seeing it through the lens of your hurt or your grief or your anger, and to a place of seeing it with more objectivity, maybe more compassion, maybe more understanding of different possibilities and different perspectives. And the same is true of our characters, right? So if your character is talking about something that happened 1 year ago versus 10 or 20 or 50 years ago, she's going to have a different perspective on it, a different relationship to it. And she'll also have had that much more experience in between the events and the telling of the events to build relationships between, this event and the umpteen other things that happen to us in our lives. And so as authors, you can choose to play with that perspective or not, right? You could also ignore it and say, well, I want my narrator to be an 80-year-old on the porch, and kind of ignore the fact that all these other things have happened. Or your narrator can bring them into her exposition and build those bridges for the reader.
So, you could have a narrator, couldn't you have, if we stay with our 80-year-old lady, who in fact has gained very little insight or wisdom from her life experiences. So she describes this series of events that have left her, bitter, maybe narrow-minded, judgmental in the world.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, it's been a long, long time since I read The Color Purple, but
right.
As opposed to someone who looks back at those events with a kind of gentleness towards herself and what she went through and the wisdom she gained. So in terms of voice,
Mm-hmm.
then the voice of the piece would be very different, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Different.
It would, and that's a great example. If your character, regardless of time and distance that have passed, if your character is bitter versus gentle, I like that word, in her reflections on the story she's telling, then the piece will have a very different tone, right? Because we're still seeing the story through the lens of that character. So this is a nice distinction between narrative point of view and character point of view. So an authorial narrator, we expect to be neutral, objective, just telling the story. And you might create mood by showing us a specific detail or adding in a certain type of weather or something. But the character narrator, the whole story is being told through her perspective. So she can point fingers and place blame and do whatever she wants to, or she can do the bridge building and have the gentle reflection about everyone's choices and what happened to her. So depending on what kind of story you want to tell and what emotions and what reflection you want the reader to have will help you make a choice about what kind of narrative to use. All right. Other questions about voice? What haven't we gotten into?
I think that was much clearer for me. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, so let's talk about finding voice. That was the other thing you mentioned. And I don't have a magic formula. I think what you should do is play with voice, practice it. So write a scene or a short story that, pick a genre you don't normally work with. An easy one is the hard-boiled detective story, because you're going to be writing more of a clipped, terse, kind of nuts and bolts type story. And then pick something like a historical romance where you're going to go into a lot of detail, and you might not even write the detective or the romance, but write in that voice, write in that style, and see how the piece changes. You could even write the same exact scene, but write it in the voice of the hard-boiled detective. Write it in the voice of the historical romance. See what you do with detail and setting and character descriptions when you alter the tone of the piece by adopting a different voice, right? And then, you also have your authorial voice, the voice that just comes naturally to you. You sit down and you write, and there it is. But I mentioned the ethos before. Your authorial voice should change according to the story that you're writing. So if you're writing a story set on a spaceship with an epic battle, you're probably going to adopt a different tone, a different style than if you're writing a contemporary mystery set in the Rocky Mountains, right? So don't think that you have a voice, that's a singular thing. You're going to have a certain organic voice, but you need to be able to shift it according to the piece you're telling. And I think that stories demand voice. They make demands on us as writers. So I like to find the voice of the piece. Some of that is organic, some of it is experimentation and just playing with things. But as I get going, it establishes itself. And then if you rest a piece, you go do research or you take a vacation or whatever, and you come back, or just every day, even just overnight can be enough of a break. Read some of your writing to get that voice playing in your head again before you sit down to write, and that will help you with the consistency. All right, questions or comments on finding your voice? Do you feel like you have a voice? Is this something you've thought about and worked on? Or have you just been writing and not thinking about voice?
I have just been writing, and so it's been organic, but a lot of the time I don't like how it sounds. It sounds like a preacher in a pulpit pounding and I don't want it to sound that way. Mm-hmm. And that's what made me aware that, and I was hoping that isn't my voice. I don't want that to be my voice. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what has made me explore it a little more.
Right. So why do you think it sounds like a preacher at a pulpit? What can you identify within the piece that gives it that quality?
Well, a lot of the
Let's see, you froze up. Oh, I think we might have lost Alan.
You didn't lose me.
Oh, good. Okay.
A lot of the parts that I took out of my story, they just felt very sharp, hammering. Mm-hmm. And as I rewrote them, they sounded better. They sounded exploratory and interesting and kind of connecting.
Good.
But my rough draft was definitely hammer and cutting. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of really what got me thinking about this whole subject.
So do you think that initial voice, the hammer cutting voice, is maybe just your exploratory voice. When you're starting to just get a story on the page, things come out in that manner, or is it unique to this draft?
You know, I hadn't thought of that. I think maybe that is my voice. I'm exploring it, and there's some things these characters are doing that I, personally don't approve of.
Mm-hmm.
Killing people is not something I approve of.
Right.
And maybe that's what it is I'm drafting my own personal feelings about this fantasy. These are not people in my world, they're in their world.
Mm-hmm.
And I had not considered that. That is a wonderful insight.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's not so bad.
Right. No, absolutely. And the first draft may or may not look similar to the final draft in terms of structure and voice, narrative qualities and such. You might use the pre-writing in your journal to just get those ideas on the page, and they might look choppy or they might look rambling or whatever. But I wouldn't judge the voice of the first draft. I would analyze it, and it sounds like that's what you did, Alan, is you looked at it and said, this isn't what I want. This isn't how this story needs to be told. And then you reshaped it. And I think one thing writers can play with is if you don't like the voice of a piece, or you aren't sure what the voice should be, you're having trouble identifying it, then try on a different persona. So you could take that authorial narrator and make it not you. The reader still experiences the authorial narrator. It can still be outside the frame of the story, neutral and objective, but maybe it has the voice of somebody who just isn't you. And you might play with other writers' work to model, to be inspired by, and play with different voices. So look at Mark Twain, look at Hemingway, look at Fitzgerald, look at your favorite genre authors, whatever direction you want to go in. Try imitating some authors whose works you admire and pick up on that voice. Just like painting students go and copy masters' paintings to explore the style and to understand the technique. And then you can assimilate the elements that work for your story and put them into that voice as you develop it.
That's a great idea. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Madeline, any thoughts about voice or any struggles that you have?
Well, I read your book on where you talked about all the things that you're mentioning today. I've always been so bored by the topic of point of view, that I never really, I just thought it was so boring. And it took me, it was really illuminating when I got your feedback on, the last draft of the manuscript I sent you, to understand why you kept saying point of view, and to understand that we're not just talking about whether it's third person or first person, but where I'm at now anyway is that we're really talking about almost becoming whoever the person is through whose eyes the reader is seeing the story.
Yes.
And that's when it really reverberates, as I've been trying to figure out how to do now, through an entire scene. Because what I was doing when I first thought I understood it, and I kind of did, I understood it more than I had, what I was doing was saying, okay, here's the scene starting. What would Colleen be feeling coming into the situation after what just happened last week? I would be asking questions like that, trying to, but what I wasn't doing was walking into the room with her as if I were in her body, literally, and looking at what was happening there and knowing enough about her to that's when it started. That's when I think I finally really got it, at least if I have got it to the point, to whatever extent I have got it at this point.
Yeah, you have got it. The chapter you sent me showed a huge leap in that, and I think you raise a really important point that we should talk about, is that your narrator, when you are in a close third, your narrator drops into that character's perspective. So even though we aren't in the dialogue and the thoughts in the voice per se of that character, the narrator in a close third, an emotionally close third where the narrator is connected to that point of view character, is going to see the world through that character's lens. So then, even though we're using the authorial narrative voice, right, for all of our exposition, we still have a perspective, an emotional closeness, and some degree of intensity about the narrative that is so closely related to that point of view character's perspective that it feels inseparable. Right? Now, the difference between first person and close third is that the close third narrator is here on that character's shoulder and can also come out and look around, turn that camera lens on other parts of the world. Whereas the first person narrator is here inside that character's head, observing exactly what that character does, using that character's voice, using that character's senses, right? So the third person can give you more freedom as the narrator. First person presents a lot of challenges to writers because they get locked in to that character and they forget to show us the expanse of the story world. But I'm glad you brought that up because I've been talking about the narrator and the point of view character like this, but in a close third, it's much more like this, right? And it is that close perspective that gives the reader the experience of living vicariously through the character without feeling like we've just been like shoved into the back of her skull to look through these little peepholes. Maybe a little bit of a crude analogy, but I think it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Other questions, voice or otherwise, could be about anything.
Okay, this is a very trivial, mundane question, but I need to understand what's happening. Okay, so I think because this is the first time I've done any kind of online course, it wasn't clear to me whether, even today, I wasn't 100% sure if I was actually going to be talking with you or if it was going to be a recording of a previous class thing. So is this the first time we've been actually talking with you? I mean, was there another one and somehow I missed it?
So there were 3 calls in July, 2 of which were recorded and placed in the library. So if you go into the school,
okay,
there is a tab at the top that says library.
Okay.
And that's where I put the recordings of these live calls. Okay.
Okay, and those were of the people who were already discussing, well, they were discussing other things.
No, so the class that you're in has recordings of live calls from the pilot session.
Okay, right, right.
these live calls, what we're on right now, are for anyone in the school, regardless of what course they're enrolled in.
Oh,
So,
okay. So we're not, all right, because that was my other question was, were we supposed to be, ready to talk about the different assignments?
no, but you can bring questions like that to this call.
Okay,
You
all
can
right.
also post a question like that in the comments under the module. And, as long as technology is working and I'm not on vacation camping, I will respond
No,
within
that's
a day
great.
or so.
That helps. I don't want to, Alan probably knew all this, but I thought, I'm not sure what's going on anymore. So, okay, great. Thank you.
No, that's a good question. It's good to clarify that.
I did not mind at all. It was just fun.
All right. Any other questions? Or just topics you want to bounce around?
Well, here I was all prepared to discuss all the exercises and readings, and so I have to shift my mind. Just questions, but let me do that for a moment, and Alan
Sure.
too.
If you have questions or comments about the material in your course, it's completely fine to bring them up here.
Well, I found it really hard to think about creating a character from the blank page,
Mm-hmm.
and even with starting with the general scenario and what kind of story, and I realized where I was often stumbling has to do with genre of all things.
Okay.
Because, I think kind of loosely some of the things I was thinking about writing about might be called women's fiction, women's contemporary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But those seem to be primarily family oriented. There's going to be some major conflict or problem within a family. And if I think of, a story that I haven't written yet, so I was conceptualizing it as a story in which a very know-it-all kind of woman who is passionate about the things she believes in. She's a social activist. She's,
Mm-hmm.
but she doesn't see herself that, in fact, she has some of the very same traits as the people she condemns.
Mm-hmm.
She's narrow-minded on the opposite end of the spectrum. So, but how, so there's no plot yet. I'm thinking, okay, there has to be something she's trying to accomplish. And without that, I can't, or even, there's no genre that the story that in a way is a moral tale to me, where the arc of the protagonist is an arc of coming to self-understanding. So I think you told me the first time you read something of mine, your protagonist thinks a lot.
Oh, really?
And they do. My protagonists tend to think way too much and not do enough. So because I can't find a genre that matches the kind of story that I'm thinking of telling. And that makes me feel like I have no models.
Okay, well, you have a ton of models. They're under contemporary fiction and literary fiction. Lots of models. Lots of stories are relationship driven. But even in a story that is character driven and something of a morality tale that results in a self-realization instead of a big event, things still need to happen to drive that character arc. And those things are going to involve other characters, other people who shape these events and help our protagonist through that journey, right? That shape the character arc. So you need to give yourself a what before who. What is going to happen? What is this character's role in the story? What do I need her to do in order to fulfill her character arc, because right now it doesn't sound like you have a good handle on the plot arc, right? But what sort of things can happen in your story that are going to result in this transformation? And if you can identify some of those things, I think you'll start finding your way into a plot. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have a question, Alan? If not, I will talk about the 5 W's and the H. All right. So I think this will help you, Madeline. I think it's related to the issue you just raised. So the 5 W's and the H, they are as fundamental to storytelling as they are to journalism. And you need to have a handle on them when you write, and your reader needs to have a handle on them when she reads your work. And I don't mean explicitly spell every one of them out. I just mean they need to be somewhere identifiable within that text. Okay. So the 5 W's and the H, who, what, when, where, why, and how, of course. Who is all about character. You need to have a solid grasp of your protagonist, your main character, and also your antagonist or antagonistic force. So the villain, whatever your protagonist is up against. What is what happens? This is all about plot. It's about the story's events and the things characters do, the choices they make, the actions they take. When does it happen? This is setting. Time, the time component of setting. Where does it happen? Also setting, but it's the location. Okay. Why? Why is the story happening, and why is it happening to your characters specifically? So why is related to character. Your character's motivations, your character's drivers, and your character's relationship to these events, something that makes this character specific to this story, right? What before who, our character needs to be in a certain role, to fulfill certain roles, to have certain characteristics and traits in order to be part of this story, okay? And then how is it all happening? These are the mechanics of it. And how is it possible? This is the plausibility of it. So how is plot, right? We've got 3 story elements that weave together like a braid: character, plot, and setting. So who and why are character, what and how are plot, and when and where are setting. Okay. Now, these are especially useful when we work out the premise of our story. And let's just go through the premise for the murder in Skakal. A newly divorced woman buys her dream house in a river arts community, only to discover it's haunted by the woman who was murdered there 40 years ago. To save her home, Jess must find the ghost's killer. So this is a single sentence. I've got a nice dash between 40 years ago and to save her home, because your premise is just short, it's punchy, it's a springboard. We aren't getting into any details here. But just in that one sentence, I've identified my W's, and we'll talk about the H a little bit later. So who? Who is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? Well, a newly divorced woman, we find out her name is Jess. There's my protagonist. The antagonist, the woman who was murdered there 40 years ago. So see how these elements are buried in that single sentence, but easily identified? So what is our setup and our plot? So what is going to happen in this story? Well, she buys her dream house. Okay, some setup there. She discovers it's haunted. Ah, there's a little plot, right? An inciting incident right there in this premise. And to save her home, Jess must find the ghost killer. That's all plot. That's what she's going to do over the course of that plot arc. When? Well, it's contemporary. We know it's now, right? She buys her dream house. But is there any other relevant time? Yes, 40 years ago. So now and 40 years ago. Where? We need to give a sense of setting. We need a grasp on that. So setting, her dream house that is haunted. All right, we've got a haunted house and in a river arts community. So maybe not farmland, but definitely small town on a river arts community, right? We have a sense of the people inhabiting that place just from those few words. Why? So this deals with the protagonist's motivation to complete the plot's goal. Well, to save her home, Jess must find the ghost killer. So what is motivating Jess to complete the plot arc? She has to save her home. All right, any questions about the W's? All right, so let's talk about that H, how. Now, how, I think, is typically outside the scope of a single sentence premise statement, but you can get it in a second sentence, okay? So how, again, is related to plot. It's the story's mechanics, and it's also, touching on plausibility here. So my second sentence would be, combining good old-fashioned detective work with the newfound ability to see the dead, Jess unearths clues, reunites a father and son, identifies a killer, and puts a troubled spirit to rest. There we go. So we know this is an amateur detective story, but also a paranormal story. And by listing those things Jess has to do in order to get to the end of her plot arc, I've touched on major plot points throughout this story, right? And then my job as a writer is to go, oh, she's going to reunite a father and son. What does that look like? Who are those characters? How is she going to do that? What role does the detective work play? What role does the psychic ability play? All right, questions and comments about the 5 W's and the H and your premise.
Well, sometimes I think I'm confusing premise with theme, or maybe some people use them differently. But, so I was wondering how they connect to the question, the simple kind of straightforward question, what is this story about? So I read, I don't know if you know James Frey, I think that's how his name is pronounced, How to Read a Damn Good Novel. It's an older book. But at one point, he uses the 3 Little Pigs. And he says, despite all the references to home building in the 3 Little Pigs, it is not a story about home building or home construction. And so, so I thought premise was, what is this story is about, was more this underlying message of it, or so. So maybe premise and theme. Maybe you could clarify that distinction, or
yeah. So okay, first, what does he say the 3 Little Pigs is really about?
Well, it's a moral tale about the industrious pig who does what needs to be done and is responsible, has to save his errant brothers. So yeah.
Right. So let's see, what would be the premise of the 3 Little Pigs? Who's our protagonist? The pig with the brick house?
Yeah, I think so. Big
okay.
Brother.
All right. So 3 Little Pigs settle in a along the banks of a beautiful creek and set about building their houses, but are plagued by a big bad wolf who destroys the first two pigs' homes, but cannot outwit the third pig, right?
Right.
So we can put all of those elements into a premise, and it gives us a sense of the 5 W's and the H, our protagonist and antagonist, what's going to happen, when and where. I didn't really touch on why or how in that sentence, but don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the premise is a simple statement of what a story is about, what is contained within it. And I see the premise functioning in two areas. The first is the very, very beginning of a story, when we as writers can take that premise and use it to launch us deeper into our story's development. And the second place is at the very, very end, when we are trying to create a concise, pithy statement of what this book is about to market it to readers. Right? So for our purposes, the premise is really concerned with plot and using it to discover the shape of the story that we want to tell, and to identify those elements we need to work with as we build our story. Now, when you ask what a story is about, that's really a two-pronged question. The first thing a story is plot. And there it all is in that premise, right? The second thing a story is about is theme. So plot is our story's events. What happens? How do these things happen? Okay. Theme is intangible. Plot's tangible. I can put it on a stage with actors and they can show it to an audience. It's doable. But theme, we're dealing with subtext, we're dealing with relationships, we're dealing with the intangible world of the story. So the plot of Three Little Pigs is about building houses and confronting a wolf who wants to eat you. But the theme of the Three Little Pigs is about being industrious, being responsible, and taking care of your brothers, even if they're losers who take shortcuts in home construction, right? So do you see how the Three Little Pigs is about both of those things?
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah. So plot is tangible, and it can also, we can look at it as a surface layer because it's obvious to all. You can just see it, right? Theme, we're getting more subtle. We're getting deeper. Readers might have to work a little bit. They shouldn't have to work too hard to identify a theme, right? But that's where the richness of story lies. That's where the uniqueness of story, of a specific story, lies, in the intangibles. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And if you're trying to find theme using the 5 W's and the H, I would look at why and how, right? How are these relationships forming? How are these events linking together? Why is this character in these relationships with other characters? Why is this character motivated to stay in this plot? So if we wanted to add theme to this notion of looking at the shape of a story through the W's and the H, I would go to why and how and ask myself those questions.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. All right, we have a few minutes left. Anything else we should touch on? Alan, do you have questions about premise or the W's and the H?
No, I feel I really like how you explained that the question words and broke down the three parts of a story. I think that's just terrific.
Great, thank you. All right, well then,
Oh, I do have
yeah.
just logistics again. So anyone who's taken things in the school will get occasionally a notice saying, here's the time for a live talk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's not on a regular basis. We just watch for an email saying on such and such a date at such and such a time.
Yes, so the schedule for August is posted in the library.
Oh, okay, right. You said,
And I also sent out an email or two with the schedule for August.
yeah.
Right now, because of travel, and also I'm trying to see if there's a time that draws the most people,
Sure.
playing around with it a little bit, but
No, that's helpful. I think probably I just didn't see that before because I hadn't signed up for anything previously. So
right.
now I've got the distinction between the particular class and the general, this format generally. So, great, thank you.
You're welcome.